Sitting on the side of his daughter's bed, Damon Saudi, the black-jeweled warlord prince of Demlin, turned the last page of the book and said, "And they all lived, happily, ever after."
"Because they had steak,"
Carrie said. Damon eyed the furry companions who had joined his girl for story time, the young Sheltie warlord who had spoken, and the younger Sheltie witch, who just wagged her tail at him. "Yes," he replied dryly. "They all lived happily ever after because they had steak."
"And cake."
Now he eyed his daughter, who entertained his mind and delighted his heart. Janelle Satien had the black hair and gold eyes typical of the long-lived races, but her skin was closer to her mother's light sun-kissed brown than his own golden brown tone, and she had the delicately pointed ears of the Dia Almon race. In fact, except for the eyes, Surreal's eyes were gold-green and slightly oversized. Janelle Satien strongly resembled Surreal at the same age. "And cake," he agreed. Recognizing her intent, he vanished the book and pounced first, tickling Janelle Satien, causing her to squeal in delight as the Shelties barked and bounced on the bed. They had cake with buttercream icing that was decorated with mounds of pink and blue flowers, which was his girl's favorite kind of cake. He eased up to let her catch her breath, and she jumped him, as he'd known she would. Being an obliging father, he fell back so that she could have her turn to tickle. Of course, him being prone also seemed to be an invitation for the Shelties to pile on. Thankfully, it was Morgan, the smaller of the two dogs, who planted a paw on his balls before he thought to put a shield over that part of himself. "I give up," he said, laughing. "I give up." Janelle Satien sprawled over him so they were almost nose to nose. Morgan had a piece of his jacket sleeve between her teeth as her small claim to him, and Carrie, who had recently had his birthright ceremony and now wore a dark opal jewel, stood behind his head staring down at him. "Papa?" "Which child?" "Wouldn't you like to have cake?" Ah, so that was where they were going with this. Decorated cakes are made for special occasions. "But I have a special jewel now." And she did. A jewel that was like no other. A jewel that had been created especially for her by the queen who had been and always would be the love of his life. But there were responsibilities that came with guiding a young witch who wore a jewel like twilight's dawn. Responsibilities, not just as a father, but as a warlord prince. Lines could be gently drawn, but they had to be drawn. "You do have a special jewel, and we celebrated when you received it. As I recall, there was a very big cake with mounds of buttercream frosting that Mrs. Beale made for that celebration." Just thinking about that frosting made his teeth hurt. Of course, that cake might have been partially responsible for him and Lucivar having to deal with overexcited children during that party. Not that he would ever say that to the large yellow jeweled witch who was his cook here at the hall. "But that was forever ago," Janelle Satien protested. "A few weeks, but even a child from the long-lived races measured time differently from the adults." "I take it you asked Mrs. Beale to make a cake?" "She said she'd already made out the menus for the next fortnight, and cake wasn't one of the sweets." "Well then." "But she'd make a cake if you told her to make one." Every time Mrs. Beale felt she had something to discuss with him, she brought her well-sharpened meat cleaver to the meeting. And even though she wore yellow and he wore black, he would admit to himself, if to no one else, that he felt a tiny kernel of fear when he had to deal with her directly. He much preferred going through Beale, the red-jeweled warlord who was the hall's butler, as well as Mrs. Beale's husband, whenever he requested a particular dish or special treat.